Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and welcome to my Procreate 4.1 demo for the piece I call Poor Sandy. So this is some Last of Us fan art. I'm really excited about the next one, but before we actually jump into this, let's go through a bit of a brush roundup, since everybody is always asking about which brushes I'm using. So I start with the hard airbrush, like I do in everything, because I color block everything out first. And then I used gouache for a majority of the skin stuff that's going on with the clicker. I just thought it had a good texture and I could work with it really nicely. And then lastly, of course, the soft brush, the big airbrush that I used to then erase away things. So that's what went into the majority of this. So let's just dive right in. So this was an old drawing that I did when I played the first Last of Us. In fact, I played the remastered one, I think is the version I played, and I absolutely loved it. So I did a drawing. So what you see there is a pencil drawing, and then I brought it into Procreate now a number of years later and decided to add some colors to it. So I also fixed a little bit of the anatomy on the arm here. It was just a little wonky, so I tweaked that a little bit, you can see. And then we get right back into the flatting portion of this. So I still use, of course, flatting as a bit of a crutch from time to time. I can't really go straight into the painting process. I'd rather block everything out and get my shapes all in there first. As I've mentioned in other videos, part of the downside to this is, of course, things become very methodical and not so freeform, and also they become a little too clean as far as the base shapes go. So you'll see way later in the piece, I go through and I actually put in a bunch of little painty areas to try and sort of mess it up a bit and give it some softer edges and just make it a little bit more naturalistic at the end. So right now it's pretty straightforward. I was referencing some Last of Us concept art, probably even some fan art, just because I was doing Google searches and I don't necessarily know everything that I was looking at, but that was mostly just to make sure I was in the ballpark of what the clickers in The Last of Us look like. Which, by the way, have they even shown the clickers in the new game? I feel like maybe they're aren't any, or they're going to be way downplayed, since everything that we've seen so far has been with humans. Unless, of course, I'm wrong and there's been a ton of great clicker stuff, which I just haven't seen it, I guess. Moving forward, we get to the mouth. Again, this is all just the standard flatting portion of everything. Get the hair in, add some extra strands here or there just to make that look better now that it's not just line art anymore. And once we're done with all of this flatting shit, we're going to move into the rendering. Now, I handled the rendering pretty differently on this one. I was actually, in some ways, just flying by the seat of my pants, trying out some stuff. So you can see here I start painting in using the gouache brush and then the eraser and just doing the usual sort of pushing and pulling that I normally do, except this time using that brush so that I can try and capitalize on the texture a little bit. But you'll see that I'm sort of lighting everything sort of neutrally. Yeah, there's that sort of edge that's not directly facing us of her big head molding stuff that gets a little bit less light. But it's sort of mostly generally lit, because the plan was always going to be to almost do a local color, local texture type thing, and then go back in with a shadow layer and add shadows. It was a big experiment, so I didn't really have a method to my madness, I guess, but I was just trying to, it's kind of really hard to say. I was just trying to sit in a weird space that I normally don't, and I was trying to play with that and see where it would go. So this is a pretty experimental piece in some ways. In other ways, it wasn't. The way I color in the mouth and all that was more or less the way that I normally would. Yeah, just, I guess, come along for the ride and you can see if it turns out well or not. Interestingly, I've already done a couple of pieces after this that I just haven't posted anywhere yet, where I go back to more of a safer area, and I think that's just as a bit of a pit stop, and then I'll go back into something a little bit more experimental. So here, you can see right there, I use the Fresco paintbrush to add in the sort of colorized, aged, not burnt, but sort of the vibe of being burnt parts. Again, this is from my reference. I saw that things were getting a little green, blue, white, sort of sickly in the center, and then as it went out, it sort of had this more just burned sort of look to it. So that's how I did that with a light brown set to multiply. And then the center part was more of a colorize than it was anything else, just to try and color that a little bit on the green side. My layer setup for this was somewhat complicated at times. I really wanted to make sure that all of these weird molding, mushroomy, fungus type pieces could be separate so that I could manipulate them as much as possible. So these are all in like sort of separate layers. Her head, her front plates are sort of all in one layer, and then the next layer back you see is in a grouping of layers, and then beyond that there'll be like another tier, and it just sort of goes back like that. But the thing that's sort of like that really weird horn that's sticking out the side, that's all part of, because I was trying to minimize my layer groupings, that's all part of like her main body. So like her arms and her body and neck, and then going into those back ridges, are all part of the same grouping of layers. So right now we're doing the mouth. The mouth is fairly straightforward because The Last of Us goes to pretty dark blacks, and I usually don't work that way. I wanted to try and make sure that I was doing that. So we've got this mouth that gets really dark in there. Really, I mean, it's basically black. You can't really perceive it as anything other than that. And then get some spittle in there just to make her even more disgusting. The blood splatter all around, which is of course gross. And now we move on to the body. So this is a whole nother set of layers, but the reason I did that face chunk first was because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I could prove out the look across the entire piece very quickly right there. So that's sort of the mentality around that. So now we're going into the body, which is a much bigger undertaking, but I've proved everything out. I've got my values, my colors, they're all saved in swatches, and it makes this part go a lot faster. A great example of like the difference between my style of coloring usually, which doesn't usually get too dark, versus The Last of Us, funny enough, is that like her cleavage, right where her two boobs come together, eventually I add like a really dark shot right in there, because it's sort of this really fast fall off that ends up happening with the lighting, where I've got everything sitting in this mid to light range, and then it's like it instantly will sink into like a very, very dark, almost black on various parts, which was just sort of out of my comfort zone. You'll see that in some other areas, but I just remember very distinctly putting a little triangle basically of darkness right there. And as the piece goes on, I make sure that there's heavy black like under her jaw and under, I guess, where her human ear would be. So you can see right there, for instance, I put shadow in there, but that shadow is still super light because the palette that I'm working with for the basically the local color of her skin is still light. And then we try to make it really dark and punchy later to mostly to try and capitalize off the look and feel of The Last of Us. There was an exercise, the exercise I guess I should say, in coloring this was, aside from just the fun of coloring it and the experience of coloring anything, was actually very similar to the Big Boss piece that I had done way back when, where I was trying to really capture the look and feel of that game while still making it my own. So in that one I decided to do a stylization that was different than the game, but then do like a palette and a sort of rendering style that felt like the game. I guess you could say that's a similar thing here, where the stylization of the character is not the same as the game, but then trying to get there with color or get there with the way it's lit. You'll also see some of the lighting thought process, I guess, when the background changes. When I started, because all the concept art that I had seen, everything was in these warm backgrounds, so I wanted to go with like a cool background. So I went with a cool background, but then in the middle of doing it, like, it didn't feel very Last of Us. The Last of Us, you know, they do a really good job of capturing that sort of like oppressive, you're around the clickers, so there's all these spores and this sort of like heavy wetness or just like heaviness to the air, and I noticed that that was just way better communicated when everything had this warm color to it, so I ended up changing the background to brown. Here I realized it was kind of silly that I had all this blood, but I forgot to put it on her teeth and her gums and all that, so just put a little bit of extra blood on the teeth, like it just is there. It's not like she's brushing her teeth every day. Poor Sandy. She used to have such a normal life. So right there, what we're doing with the blood is, that is a just a very bright red, almost all the way in the top right on the square, and set to multiply with the opacity then slightly adjusted. And then I've used the smear tool, the smudge tool, to like smudge and smear things around a bit, so that it looks a little disturbed as opposed to like perfectly splattered. It won't look completely fresh then. This right here is probably the most straightforward part of the whole piece, which is just, I'm literally just painting the shirt like I would paint the shirt any other way. At the end of it, once all the rendering is done, I do go in and add blood and add sort of like sweat or just like dirt and grit to bring it into the look of the rest of the piece. But this is definitely the most straightforward part of the whole illustration. There's a part you'll see where I toy with making the shirt ribbed, kind of like the way like a tank top would be, like that vertical ribbing, but then I abandoned it, mostly because I just wasn't feeling it. And then when this picture's all zoomed out and everything, you can't see it anyways. It would only be appreciated if it was like blown up, so it wasn't really worth it. So we ended up adding a little bit of texture there with the Hessian brush. I also used the Hessian brush for her pants when we get to her pants. I didn't include that in the beginning because it's just a quick texture thing. I actually, throughout the whole piece, probably used a handful of brushes that are, I guess, maybe potentially interesting, but it's all just done by feel. There's no like logic to it, and I try not to be prescriptive with this stuff. The point of me going through these is not for you all to go out and use these exact brushes to do this exact illustration. It's to just sort of see the thought process and see why you might want to choose a certain thing when you're doing your own illustrations. So now onto the hair. The hair is fairly stylized. Some of the other textures in this piece skew a little more realistic or a little more textured, but the hair is pretty stylized in this one. And onto the pants. When I look at these pants that she's wearing, I just instantly see George Costanza, because when I was doing these pants, I was watching an episode of Seinfeld, and I feel like I was watching Seinfeld a lot when I was doing this piece, which maybe isn't the right inspiration, I guess, but whatever. So you can see when I did my original flats, I didn't include the fraying from the jeans. That was just because I wanted to get into painting right away and start proving out some of the skin stuff, so I could essentially just inspire myself to keep going. And then once I got into this and I had to throw in the button and throw in the fraying, then it was fine. I had already sort of blocked out the major shapes for it anyways. I just had to make sure that I remembered to do it and not leave it alone by the time that I got down to it. For the shirt and for the pants, I use a combination of the hard air brush and the softer one, because I want to capture these volumes in just a more straightforward way. And then I went in and used the Hessian brush for the highlights on the pants, but there's not... I didn't use that skin brush, the gouache brush, for anything really other than the skin throughout this whole thing. A lot of the other stuff I just reverted back to normal brushes that I use more often. Then here's some just dirt, one of the random texture brushes, and then smeared it up a bit, lowered the opacity on it. That's how you get that. And then you can see here with the bigger shapes for the fraying, I then added little bits of fraying things just to try and bring some real world I guess, material to it, really, is what it comes down to. So now you can see here, I threw in this background real quick, and now I'm using a, see, is it black and then it's lowered in opacity? No, I think it actually is a blue set to multiply, but it's a very desaturated, almost greenish blue, and that's what I'm using here to now add extra shadow and volume to her. Now you see a lot of things flying around there. That was me blurring her and then erasing everything except for the stuff in the top right so that I could get like a bloom going on in the top right of her, which you'll see that get adjusted a little bit more. I make it a standard practice whenever I finish a piece to sit on it for a day or two before I do anything with it, because I know I'm going to look at it and I'm going to get another idea. In fact, the next piece that I'm going to show you guys on here, I have changed it like, I don't know, 15 times in the last 2 days at the last second, so that happens. So now we're putting in the rim light on the bottom left side of her, brightening it up a little bit and making it just so that we can really define her form on the darker side of her. She now has a shadow layer that's going through and adding additional shadows, and then she's also got a gradient shadow that's going across her to bring one side of her darker than the other. You can see that thing I was talking about in her cleavage. She now has that really dark little triangular shadow there, and also in like her belly button, under her ear and her jaw, under her arm that's closest to us, her left arm, the way her boob casts a shadow onto her distant arm. These are all much heavier than I would usually do, and so it's just to try and push the look. So there we had that background shift where I brought some of it warmer but then left its deepest shadows still kind of cool, which gives that interesting sort of print effect. And then this is done with the sable brush in the organic section. That's how I did these little like fuzzy bits and just used these like upward strokes at different angles to try and get that. And then ultimately what I do is I duplicate that layer and I make it the color of the light. And then because of the nature of that brush, it shines through and it gives this really cool effect like it's being lit from behind. Here just adding a bunch of little spores. This is where I'm starting to add in a lot of the atmosphere, that oppressive nature I was talking about earlier that the Last of Us has when you're in these environments. Adding a little bit more background debris, which was just thrown in really quick, and then I warped it and desaturated it and changed it just to reduce its importance in the piece but still fill in a little bit of the background. Now here's where I start doing some extra detailing because I thought that some of the definition was soft across the piece. Because I was painting this whole thing in a way that I wasn't used to, I had to make sure that I was tweaking things a little bit. There's a bunch of just damage around the outside to really continue selling the atmosphere of this. Some of the fungus and stuff that's going on at the bottom was done with the cotton brush, which is in the, was it natural section, nature section? Organic section, whatever it is. It's like the second to last category of brushes. You'll find it. So now it's probably hard to see, but I'm going in and I'm doing a lot of little tweaks with a brush, just damaging certain things and rounding out certain things. In fact, staring at it right now, I can't even tell you exactly which part I'm on, but maybe you eagle-eyed viewers out there can keep track of all the little tweaks that's happening right now. Ah yeah, I see where I'm at now. I'm in the... Well, I was on her wrist. This is even fun for me. I have no idea what I'm doing. Oh, there we go. So we're on her hand. And now you can see some of those paint lines going on the outside of her hand and down her arm. And this is me starting to just add a little bit more of an organic feel around certain aspects. Now we're just going to round out her jaw because it's a little too sharp right now. Make it look a little more natural and like it actually blends in with her body a bit more. And here we add a little bit more definition around that edge of her, like her neck and her shoulder and stuff. We're adding some more depth and some rim light from what's going on in the top right. Same thing with up on her head crown, plates, moldings, I don't know, whatever we want to call them. This is also an opportunity to add some extra little details, some little hairs that are sticking off, or like chunks of fungus or whatever it is. We're on the shoulder now, you can see. And now up on the hand a little bit, and the arm. It's a nice little opportunity to sharpen some stuff up and really define it and turn form in some cases a little bit better. And this is going to wrap it up. You'll see a few things flicker at the very end, but this is essentially it. So that's the final piece. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm pretty excited about the next game, and this was really fun and experimental to do. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting like and subscribe and notifications and all that other crap. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.